to this wonderful week of presentations on the Mediterranean. So we look forward to hearing your comments and perhaps having a chance to sign your book.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you all for the kind words on the book, those of you who have spoken to me. And Terry Burke gave you a kind of overview of the Mediterranean and world history issues in the long 19th century from 30,000 feet. And so I thought it might be entertaining to drill in and to use the episode of Bonaparte's invasion of Egypt, which I think is an episode that's very colorful and has a lot of good teaching material in it, to talk about some of the big issues in Mediterranean history, and so to play off of it. When we think about why it should have occurred to the French to invade Egypt in 1798, it's interesting to me that one of the things that's happening in the 1790s in France is of course, they've had their revolution, and they're extremely polarized between the revolutionary forces of various sorts, some of them radical, some of them liberals, but committed to the revolution, committed to the idea of republic. And then there are a lot of people left over from the old regime who have, reservations about all this change. Many of them very well off, or from the old aristocracy, who, as you go to elections, emerge as a political force and actually win some of the elections, so that the people who are doubtful about the revolution actually come back into power in a way. And so this polarization is tearing France apart in some ways. There's a lot of distrust of the outcome of those parliamentary elections in the later mid to late 1790s. And so Talleyrand, who ultimately served in Napoleon, the first cabinet, but who was a revolutionary figure in the 1790s, had at one point to run away to America in fear of his life after the revolution and during the radical period of the Jacobin and the Terror. And he became convinced that the United States didn't have exactly the same problems as France as a new republic with regard to extreme internal polarization. And he thought that the energies that in France went into a kind of unhealthy internal bickering between the left and the right, in the New World, that energy was being put into Ohio. That it was the frontier and the Native Americans and the struggle with them and so forth that took those energies and deflected them from paralyzing the State Assembly of New York and so forth. So he actually thought that France needed a frontier, that Republican France, that the character of Republican governance is such that it's internally divisive and paralyzing and vicious, and that only if the Republic has a frontier can it avoid tearing itself apart. And this theory of Talleyrand, isn't up there. It's not well known as the great social theories of the 19th century are. But you could make the case. And we see this in the United States, even in the past decade. Haven't we recreated frontiers as a way of winning elections and putting coalitions together and so forth? So that's one. As France reconstituted itself after the revolution, You know, it was immediately attacked by the conservative monarchies of the continent. Austria was, there were riots in Austria when the king was executed, and the French Revolution was extremely unpopular in most of continental Europe, certainly among the upper classes, but I think even there's evidence of artisans and people, you know, who were formed in a monarchical society think you ought to have a king, and these French were going in very strange directions that were threatening. And so there were, the France was immediately attacked and had to fight off the Austrians and others, and ultimately emerges as a great power. And of course the British are among those hostile to the revolution. And the French look at the British, and what do they see is a naval seagoing empire with very extensive properties. By that time, by the 1790s, the British had Bengal in India, and indeed were reaching out towards the rest of India already. And so there were economists and political thinkers in revolutionary France who thought that France was at a disadvantage because France lost its colonies for the most part. Of course it had once been a great imperial power, and it had parts of southern India, and it had Quebec and so forth. But what we call the French and Indian War, some historians have viewed as an 18th century world war between the French and British empires, and which the British won. And as a result of which, the French were no longer in Madras in India, and indeed all they got was this little tiny place called Pondicherry, which was very nice, but not a basis for geopolitical power. Then they lost Quebec, which the Quebecois have never quite adjusted to. And they lost because of, interestingly enough, because of the impact of revolutionary French ideas on the colonies. They lost Haiti to revolutionary former African slaves. So there were those who argued that France needs a naval seagoing external empire in order to compete with the British, that it has to get that back. There's this odd idea that grows up of, well, we're republics, so how can we have an empire? And they look back to the Roman Republic, which after all had territories outside of the Italian peninsula. And they developed this idea of subordinate sister republics, which they want to spread republicanism, they want to reform territories as republics, but then they want those republics in some way to look to Paris as their older sibling, as the real power. And in a way, this model was deployed of republican empire, not only in Egypt, but throughout the Mediterranean and indeed in Europe. So under the French, revolutionary French, the Netherlands becomes such a sister republic. Subordinate to France in some ways, French military occupation in some ways, but then with elections and a Netherlands republican system. And 3 republics are made in what is now Italy, all of them subordinate to France. So there exists a continental model for what they do in the rest of the world. And so it's a kind of militant republicanism, but republican empire. And it seems self-contradictory, but of course the United States also went in for that kind of thing. What were we doing exactly in the Philippines? And there's been a Republican empire here as well. Then there was an economic argument for these overseas naval empires because having lost the Caribbean, the French lost out in that famous triangle of slaves and sugar and rum, the trading routes of the Mediterranean. Didn't provide them with the same kind of economic advantage as the transatlantic kinds of trade. So they still had Martinique and a little bit of sugarcane from there, but they lost most of their Caribbean possessions. And Egypt occurred to them in part because it provides some of the same kinds of crops as the Caribbean would have if they had kept their Caribbean possessions. So it has sugarcane, for instance, and a lot of grain. There's another thing is in the 1790s, there were grain famines in France. It was the tail end of the early modern cooling period, which some people inaccurately, or it's widely referred to inaccurately as the Little Ice Age. I don't know how that got started because it wasn't an ice age. It's not like the glaciers didn't come down. It was just really cold, in most of continental Europe, and it was a European phenomenon. It was not global. It wasn't like the medieval warming period, which was all over the world. It has to do with meteorological phenomena in the Atlantic in particular, but it was a European thing. Anyway, it was cold in Europe in this period. And the 1790s, partly because of climate fluctuations, partly because of the disruptions of the revolution, partly because of the way that capitalist agriculture developed in northern France. For various reasons, there were shortfalls in grain production, and so there were bread riots. One of the things that made France so turbulent in the 1780s and 90s. So Egypt famously is a breadbasket in the pre-modern world because the way it works. The Nile Valley was extremely fertile, and it was partly because there was an annual inundation of the Nile waters. The weather systems in that part of North Africa actually are part of the Indian monsoon system. So when the monsoons come, it rains in Uganda and Ethiopia in the headwaters of the Nile, and then the waters rush to the Mediterranean, and they inundate the shores. And so along the Nile, people used to put their houses up on stilts and things because it's like New Orleans, it just inundate. I once in Egypt, I was talking to an old Egyptian, and I talked about an annual flood in that period, and he said, "It's not a flood. It wasn't viewed as a natural disaster. It was viewed as something positive because it would then deposit silt on land on either side of the Nile. It was natural fertilizer at a time before industrial-style fertilizer or petrochemicals had arisen. So the soil was enormously fertile, and you could just grow enough grain to feed half of the Middle East. Half of the Ottoman Empire was being fed from Egypt. And some of it was being smuggled to Marseille in this period. About 15% of French grain was coming from Egypt in the 1790s. It wasn't that the Ottomans authorized this, it was being smuggled. So that was another reason to go there, is that they had a desire for grain. And why Bonaparte? Well, Bonaparte emerged in the mid to late 1790s as a really innovative and successful general fighting in the Italian peninsula against the Austrians. And he won, and as I said, he made these 3 republics in what is now Italy. But if you're in Italy, if you're an Italian power, as Bonaparte was, then the Adriatic Sea is your backyard. And in fact, you're a neighbor of the Ottoman Empire. So, you know, maybe the Ottomans and the Eastern Mediterranean and the Adriatic look distant from Paris, but once your power base is Italy, then it's all right next door. In fact, nowadays with the Albanian immigration and so forth, it's at home. And of course, Italy often Italian pre-modern republics had toeholds over on the Balkan side. So Bonaparte was well aware that Dubrovnik, which at that time was called Ragusa, half of its trade was with Alexandria in Egypt. So once you're an Adriatic power, then Egypt starts to attract your attention, and indeed, the entire Ottoman Empire is just next door, and it's an economic opportunity, it's a geopolitical rival. And Bonaparte had long been interested in the Middle East and in the Ottoman Empire, being from Corsica, being from this island in the Mediterranean. The Arabs just weren't very far away, and so he read these 18th century French chronicles of the rise of Islam and of the Arabs. In the Abbasid period, there was a local revolt in eastern Iran led by a kind of messianic figure, the veiled prophet. And Bonaparte read about this as a youth, and he actually wrote a short story based on it. So the Middle East was something that was in his imagination as a Corsican, I think, anyway. And then once he was in Italy, it was right next door. And he thought, he had a theory that the Ottoman Empire was going to collapse fairly soon in reaction to these big changes that were happening in the world in his own lifetime. And that somebody was going to pick up the pieces, and he thought it should be France. He was wrong about the timing of this, but he was right about the general proposition. So what he thought was going to happen in the early 19th century didn't actually happen until World War I. But it did eventually happen, and France did pick up a lot of the pieces in Syria and so forth. So Bonaparte became interested in Egypt for these reasons. So this is the slide about the fear that the Ottomans would collapse, and if the Ottomans collapsed, then the British and the Russians might pick up the pieces, which would be undesirable from a French point of view, especially the British, because they were at war with the French at that time. And so Bonaparte thought that since the Ottoman Empire was probably on its way out, better to do a preemptive war and try to get some of it for France right away. And then one of the big changes that we see in this period is the rise of merchant capital to political power. So, it's not that the business classes weren't always influential, but let's face it, if you're dealing with empires and emperors and aristocrats and so forth, a lot of times their focus is on landed wealth. After all, what is an aristocracy? The noble classes of Europe, they had estates, right? And so they were very focused on their estates and agriculture as a form of wealth. And there were economists in the 18th century in France the physiocrats who argued that wealth was agricultural wealth and who discounted trade. But in fact, trade and international trade was increasing in this period, and then you had the beginnings of, as Terry talked about, industrialization from 1750 forward. So the business classes were coming up in the world. And it's not true, as the Marxists thought, that they made minor cousins of the aristocracy. And of course, there were lots of groups involved, including popular groups. But the business classes were benefited from the revolution because they influenced a lot of legislation afterwards. So the rise of the business classes to more political power, it intersects with a lot of things. It intersects with nationalism. So when Terry was talking about the rise of Greek nationalism in the first quarter of the 19th century and the Greek revolt of the 1820s against the Ottomans and the achievement of their independence in 1826, who funded that, who really pushed for it, were Greek Mediterranean merchants. Some of them based on the Turkish side. The Fenariats were one of the big merchant families that were big nationalists. So the rise of the business classes and the impact of new forms of capitalism intersect with nationalism in some ways. But they then also intersect with this desire, this renewed desire for overseas colonies. It's very controversial what role the colonies played in European economic efflorescence in this period. But even conservative European economists who don't want to put so much emphasis on colonies, I think admit that about 15% of capital in Europe was coming from colonialism. And it's some of them call it ghost acreage. It was like you had sugarcane and other wealth-producing estates that the money of which was going straight into European capitals, but the acreage wasn't in Europe per se. The import-export merchants were particularly interested in nailing down trading routes, nailing down territory on which commodities like rubber and cotton and sugarcane and so forth could be grown. This tendency increased through the 19th century, but it was already there in the 1780s and 90s, and so there was a Marseille lobby for French intervention in Egypt. And the local ruling elite in Egypt, the Mamluks, who were vassals of the Ottoman Sultan, increasingly were favoring the Russians and the British. Some of them were Russians. Some of them were from Georgia. They had loyalty to Catherine. And so the French merchants in Cairo and Alexandria were very upset by these developments and felt badly treated. And so I founded the French National Library, this dossier of plans for an Egyptian expedition coming from these Marseille merchants. And also, because you had the Italian campaign, you started to have a big military equipment production in France. And once you had the factories going and you were making military goods, it would be very bad for peace to break out. So they seem to have, lobbied for further military adventures. And then also, when you mobilize a lot of men for a campaign like that in Italy, you're a little bit afraid about demobilizing them. They know how to fight, they're not down on the farm anymore, and there are a lot of them. If you just bring them back, won't they be an element of disorder? So Henry Kissinger actually appears to have delayed the end of the Vietnam War in part because he was afraid of bringing home 500,000 grunts all at once. That would cause trouble back home. And of course, we have had in American history those problems of what to do with a demobilized army. Even George Washington had that problem. So, so sending them off to Egypt was attractive in some ways, and indeed sending Bonaparte off to Egypt was attractive to some in the Directory at the time, because he was clearly full of himself, and he was a rising star, and who knows what he would get up to if you left him in France. And those people who had those suspicions were perfectly correct. Then the enemy of the French Revolution, the British, had already this a good deal of India, and for most purposes, you would send, you know, heavy goods and armies and so forth back and forth between Britain and India at that time around the Cape of Good Hope. But if you wanted to get messages through, or silk or something light, then you could take the Egypt route, because it was before the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal wasn't built until 1869. And so what you had to do was to take a ship from Britain through the Straits of Gibraltar to Alexandria, Egypt, go up the Nile, and then at a certain point beyond Cairo, you would, in Upper Egypt, you would offload the ship, put the stuff on camelback, take it over to Tena, which is a town on the Red Sea, and then load it onto a ship in the Red Sea, and then you could go on to India. So there was maybe 60 miles of land that had to be traversed before the Suez Canal. And it made it you couldn't send cannon that way and things like that. It was just difficult. Unless it was an emergency, in which case you might try, or if you were just like sending an urgent message to your governor in Bengal or Bombay, you would use the Egypt route. And so losing Egypt to France would be bad for the British Empire in India. And nothing pleased Bonaparte more than the deliciousness of causing bad things to happen to the British. And in fact, Bonaparte kind of wanted to invade Britain. The difficulty was in getting across the channel, that the British Navy was so good it would just like probably blow the French out of the water. It would be like the Spanish Armada all over again. So Bonaparte was not an able person. He made his career in land artillery. And so I think the cooler heads prevailed and said, no, we're not going to do the Britain campaign. But they had made an army of Britain, which was intended as the invasion force. So they repurposed it for Egypt. But this was an indirect way of getting at the British by going to Egypt. Bonaparte pioneered in this rhetoric of liberal imperialism, which we have seen re-emerge in our own time in a very forceful way. So I'm very struck by it. If you go back and read Bonaparte's speeches about Egypt, they're going to be grateful to be liberated. They're under Ottoman tyranny and despotism, so why wouldn't they like to be in a French republic instead? Even manipulation of culture, so there's good Islam and bad Islam, and the good Muslims will be with us, and then they have to repress the extremists, and they're responsible for their civilizational role. And then, Egypt had been glorious under the pharaohs, and this was at a time before Europeans knew very much about ancient Egypt. What they knew was mainly from the Bible, and there hadn't been the breakthroughs in archaeology and so forth. And Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt actually was the foundation for coming into a firmer knowledge of the pharaonic past. But the Europeans did know, or did think of Egypt as having been once glorious and then fallen into decadence and the decay. And why was that? Well, because they were badly ruled. So if only they were well ruled, then Egypt would re-emerge as a great center of civilization. And how nice of the French, to do that favor for the Egyptians, to restore them to themselves. So a foreign military occupation in this rhetoric is reconfigured as actually a form of charity which benefits the psychological and civilizational well-being of the occupied. And again, all of these tropes that Bonaparte, I think, helped to invent in the first stage of the early republicanism in the 1790s were elaborated on and in later republican empires, and you see them. The Americans said the same things, in the Philippines and then more recently in Iraq. So just to give you a sense of where Bonaparte and his army were going to land, this is the Egyptian Delta. It's like Louisiana. It's very flat, just a little bit above sea level. So get to know it because it's not going to be there probably by the end of the century. Most of it is less than 4.5 feet above sea level. And
also, they don't have the silt deposits anymore to keep building up.
yeah, that's probably, there's a subduction. These river valleys, they sink over time, and you have the same problem in Louisiana. But that's a slower process. We're talking about hundreds, maybe thousands of years before it disappeared because of that. But 4-level sea rise, 4-foot levels, a 4-foot increase in sea level over the next 80 years, that would just sink it. The delta in Egypt and Bangladesh and parts of India and Bengal are the most threatened by sea level rise. And since most of Egypt lives in the delta, I've got 83 million people, I think probably 60 million live in the delta. Finding another place for all those people to live is going to be a problem. It's going to cause a lot of trouble. Anyway, I'm getting off on a track, yeah.
It's also where they produce most of their food.
Yeah.
And their lifestyle
Yes.
is just unchanged.
Yeah. There's two growing seasons in the delta, whereas there's only one in Upper Egypt. No, it's bad. It's bad if it goes. But anyway, that's what Bonaparte had his eye on initially was the delta. He landed at Alexandria and then came down to Cairo. He took with him a city. There's 54,000 troops and sailors. It was incredible. 13 ships of the line. And the French made all of these warships in the 1790s to take on the British. So at the time, they were almost up to British quality and size with regard to their warships. And that's why I think, Bonaparte, his strategy was he was kind of like to play chess. I mean, people asked, how firm were his plans maybe to go on from Egypt elsewhere, maybe even to India, to challenge the British there. I think he was open to whatever developed, right? So if things had gone well in Egypt, then he would have gone on to the next thing. He did try to go on to Syria. And who knows, sometimes he thought about going on to Istanbul, sometimes he thought about going to India. He was open, and I don't think the plans were very firm, but I do know in spring of 1798, before he went to Egypt, he did ask the National Library to send over the maps that they had of India from the old French colonies there. So that was one thing that was on his mind. And then they marched to Cairo. And one of the things I'm doing, and I think this is maybe good pedagogically, is when you teach something like this, is I went to the paintings. And there were a lot of very interesting paintings that came out of this military expedition. They didn't have photography yet. And moreover, I think that the paintings that were done in Egypt fed into a big battle in the art world in the Mediterranean at the time, in France and Italy and elsewhere, over Romanticism and Classicism, which had to do with things like what is the place of emotion versus reason, what is the place of good governance versus revolution. And I think that the Romantics were closer to a kind of folkish nationalism. And I would argue that the invasion of Egypt was very good for Romantic art. And of course, it also has some of the seeds of Orientalist art, which was a whole movement in European art, which depicted the Orient, or by which they meant mainly the Middle East, as exotic, as sensual, so there are all those harem scenes, and as kind of frozen in time in some ways, as irrational, but then also as kind of the remnants of a glorious civilization and so mysterious and intriguing. And sometimes this Orientalist art was used to, emphasize European superiority, and I think the classicists especially saw it that way. But sometimes I think it was also used to critique European modernity. This is a depiction of Bonaparte at what he called the Battle of the Pyramids. He was such a great publicist. Because this battle happened in Embaba. And Embaba isn't anywhere near the pyramids. I mean, you might be able to see them peek up, and of course they were half buried at that time. So, but he called it the Battle of Pyramids, and that's the headlines back in France. And of course they won. They were fighting against a Mamluk army, which was not a bad little army. It had pretty good firearms. They're excellent cavalrymen, and they ran circles around the French cavalry. But they had some artillery, but they didn't have a lot of wheeled artillery. This is what Terry was talking about, like the field artillery and the military revolution. And it was not because they didn't know about it or they were backward, but the wheels get stuck in the sand, and so operating field artillery over the long term in Egypt was very difficult. The French could do it with a push, but it made more sense to the Mamluks to fix their artillery in concrete emplacements, and then they couldn't turn them, and they weren't as mobile as the French. And the French had developed ways of, they had what were called infantry squares. They would put the infantry in a square with the bayonets and the firearms shooting out, and they would protect the artillery and the cavalry inside the infantry square until a certain point, and then the cavalry would come out and surprise the enemy, and could retreat then to the safety of the infantry square. Horses are wonderful engines of war. They're brave. They'll ride down on the enemy. But if you've got a line of infantrymen with bayonets and firearms pointed at you, horses are not stupid. They will never, ever ride at the Mamluks tried, and they just would swerve off at the last minute. They won't ride into that. Of course, they would be killed. So the French had superior military tactics, but it wasn't, it wasn't like a slam dunk. I mean, the Mamluks acquitted themselves well, and the French admitted this. Once the French established their rule, as with all imperial conquerors, they thought they were popular, but in fact, there was a lot of disgruntlement with their policies. The Egyptians at the time their kind of Islam was Sufi, and it was all about saint shrines, and if you couldn't have a son, you would go to the saint shrine and pray for one. And a little bit like Mexican Catholicism in that regard. And The French engineers thought that the Egyptian streets were, winding, and it made it difficult to get the troops through, and it was just bad engineering. And it was because of the lack of wheels in the Middle East, because of the sand and so forth, livestock. And so if you have mainly donkeys and horses, it's why Paris is like it is, except in the houseman parts of it that were redone. But if you have horses and donkeys and camels and so forth, you can have winding streets, it doesn't matter. So the French engineers under Bonaparte started knocking down walls and trying to make broad esplanades, and they would just obliterate these Sufi shrines that people loved and venerated. And so there were dissatisfactions, and in October of 1798, the people in Cairo mounted a massive sort of civil revolution against the French. And the only way the French survived just being massacred was to go up into the hills above Cairo with artillery and fire cannonballs down on people until they acquiesced. Again, you will note that these kinds of tactics recur through modern history, and these kinds of conquests, that Bonaparte did in Egypt. I mean, his particular adventure in Egypt was a failure, but the French come into Algeria in 1830 later on, and all through the Algerian colonial period, they looked back at the Bonaparte expedition to Egypt as a precursor, a glorious one. And the French don't leave Algeria until 1962. And the French take Tunisia in 1881. The British take Egypt in 1882. The Spanish take the Spanish Sahara in 1885. So all of North Africa is going to end up in European hands. And Morocco not until the 20th century, and Libya likewise not until 1911 under the Italians. But Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt was a harbinger of what was to come. The Mediterranean was going to become one political unit. And nowadays, when we other the Middle East and we think about it as alien or as full of strange traditions and strange politics and so forth, we forget that most of what we call the Middle East has been under European rule for much of the last 2 centuries. Yes?
During this invasion, when Napoleon marched into Egypt, what was the role of the Ottoman Empire?
Well, the Ottomans were the Ottoman Empire, being an empire, was made up of directly ruled territories and then vassal states. So in vassal states, there was a local elite, and they were supposed to send some money and maybe men for military expeditions and things occasionally. It was almost a feudal kind of system to Istanbul when asked. In the 18th century, the Ottomans decentralized and were fairly weak, and so I think a lot of times the Egyptian Mamluks didn't actually send much money. But they weren't, in their own minds, they weren't independent. They were vassals of the Ottomans. So Bonaparte saw that the Mamluks weren't sending their annual tribute to Istanbul and were more or less in rebellion against the Sultan. So he represented himself as an agent of the Ottoman Sultan. Said that these, traitorous Georgians have detached Egypt from the Sultan's domain, and I'm going to do him a favor by defeating them, and then I'm an ally of the Ottoman Sultan. So in a way, by France taking Egypt, we restored it to the empire. This argument didn't have much purchase in Istanbul, and the Ottomans immediately mobilized to ally with the British to get the French right back out of Egypt. And in 1801, that's what happened. It was a joint British-Ottoman operation that ultimately got the French out. The way that the French troops were gotten out was that the British offered to transport them once they had surrendered. And at that time, in the 18th century, you had to sign a pledge. So that the French soldiers all signed a pledge that they would never again fight the British. They would be in the army and they could fight on the continent, but they would never again fight the British. And that was the price of being transported back to France on British ships. And the scientists, that Bonaparte brought along a couple hundred scientists, and some of these were luminaries of the French intellectual establishment. I mean, it would be as though Bush had taken, you know, our famous novelists and Nobel Prize winners off to Baghdad. And many of them found new species of fish, or they measured, they were Enlightenment scientists, so they measured Egypt, they measured how tall the Egyptians were, they measured the buildings, they made all the pictures of all the buildings. There's this 26-volume description of Egypt that came out of this expedition and was ultimately printed, which is everything you would ever want to know about 18th century Egypt, all the plates and how they made this, that, and the other thing. Some of those scientists, the British said, well, we'll let you go back to Paris, but we're keeping the specimens. And they said, no, we'll go to London with you. So a lot of that stuff is in the British Library now, because the science, and some of the continuing Egyptology that the French began was continued then in London, because they had to surrender. The scientists went with the British. And many of the sketches that they made and so forth are there in the British Library. So the revolts and putting down revolts are a big part of European rule of the southern Mediterranean ever after in the 19th century. The Algerians revolted on a number of occasions and were put down in each case with these superior battle tactics. And you know, the thing about warfare is you don't have to be very much better than the other guy. Like if I've got a gun that shoots 1 foot further than your gun, you're dead. I don't have to be like master of the universe to defeat you. And so we think about this last 200 years as a time of overwhelming European superiority. I just would like to caution that often it wasn't overwhelming. It was 51-49. But if it's consistently 51-49, then you know you win. So that's what was going on in Algeria and Egypt and so forth later on as well. Bonaparte also pioneered with a lot of propaganda techniques, and so this is the argument. Islam is a form of soft power in the Middle East, as Christianity is a form of soft power today in American politics. You can see it. And so Bonaparte was eager to deflect it as an anti-French element. And so he went to the Egyptian middle classes, which included the Egyptian clergy, and said, look here, those Mamluks were feudal oppressors of you. They weren't even Egyptian. And we're going to put you in charge. We're going to make an Egyptian republic on the French model. And you'll have a parliament. It was called in Arabic a diwan. You will elect your leader. And you'll be in charge. And you like Islam, so implement Islam. And in fact, you know, the Ottoman state policy often went by what was practical rather than what was in Islamic law. And if you look at those Ottoman qanuns, or kind of imperial decrees about punishment for crimes and so forth, they're not exactly what's in the Muslim religious texts. But Bonaparte said, you want Sharia? You can have Sharia. And in a sense, Bonaparte invented the modern Islamic Republic. He promoted the Muslim clergy as leaders of French Egypt. And he did this in order to stop Islam from being used to oppose the French occupation. He also made an argument that, okay, so you had the Enlightenment in France, and you had this rationalist revolt against Trinitarian Christianity. The French dethroned the Pope in a way. They dethroned the Catholic Church. You know, they turned the Notre Dame into a temple of reason. So the Muslims have a critique of Trinitarian Christianity and of kind of Roman Catholic imperialism, the Holy Roman Empire sort. So aren't we Enlightenment deists who just believe in one God and without all of this fancy Christian theology? Aren't we really kind of, sort of Muslims? And this was an argument that Bonaparte made all the time he was there, that the French were at the very least culturally and theologically aligned with the severe monotheism of Islam against Trinitarian Christianity, and that they were a kind of Muslim. So, you know, the Muslim clergymen, some of whom cooperated with the French in the Egyptian newly formed parliamentary body, said, well, you know, there are these other things about Islam, like not drinking wine, getting circumcised. You know, it's not just all about monotheism of a pure sort. And one of them said, you know, otherwise Jews would be Muslims too, you know. So Bonaparte had to negotiate with the Al-Azhar seminary about whether his troops would be considered Muslims. And they said, well, you know, maybe, but there's this circumcision business and the wine business. And the negotiation, adult circumcision, a difficult proposition, and French giving up wine. Bonaparte said that's just, you know, not likely to happen. So what would happen if we declared them Muslims but they continued to drink wine? And the clergy said, well, okay, so I guess you could say they were Muslims, but they will go to hell. Bonaparte said, well, you know, that's not a really good bargaining chip for me. So, but actually, you know, the ways in which the Americans in Iraq enthroned the Shiite fundamentalist parties like the Dawa Party, which is still in charge of Iraq, has some similarities to Bonaparte's politics with the Sunni Muslims. I imagine we must be out of time.
The bells of 12 noon have run, but we really don't want to disadvantage you, I think.
Well, let's just take maybe 10 minutes worth of questions.
Okay,
I'll leave it there.
I have consensus here pretty much, I think.
Yeah,
Go for
finish
it.
the images.
Yes.
No, well,
This is really
I can
compelling.
show you the rest, just really quickly, some of the rest of the, this is where Bonaparte pardons, this is the great magnanimous pardoning of the Cairenes. Not sure exactly what else he could do, massacred them all, he needed them. Then he went to Syria, and there were, what do you do with troops that get the plague?
Yeah.
So Bonaparte probably had them killed, but this was a scandal. So this is a famous Orientalist depiction of all that, in which actually his troops are depicted as Muslims, taking up on that trope. They were kind of Muslim. And this is one of his generals, Dessay, who was reading out Bonaparte's proclamation to the Egyptians that he came to liberate them from the Mamluks, and that he's a kind of Muslim, and he came there at the behest of the Ottoman Sultan, and so forth. And one of the Egyptian chroniclers said that the peasantry, people in the villages, actually bought some of this stuff. That's the last picture I'll show you. By the way, if you...
Speaking about Al-Jabakti,
yeah.
they have a reading from Al-Jabakti.
Oh, yes, so it might be in the reading that you have that
and his
talks about this.
skepticism about
Yes.
Napoleon and Islam.
If you, the next time you visit Paris and you go to the Arc de Triomphe, stand inside and look up at the names of the generals that are all around the Arch. They're to say, all of the ones who went with Bonaparte to Egypt are there on the Arc de Triomphe. You can see them there. So, questions, yes?
Yes.
Let's have short declarative questions
Yes.
rather than...
Yes, yes. Could you tell us, especially me, maybe other colleagues already know, explain to me a little bit of General Alexander Dumas,
Yes.
the rival of Napoleon, because from what I read, he was suppressed.
Yes.
The father of Alexander,
Yes.
the novelist.
Yes. Well, there was a lot of politics inside there among the generals, but I think the more interesting thing about Dumas is that all of that imaginative literature of the 19th century, like the Count of Monte Cristo and so forth, that came out of the two Dumas descendants, you know, I think it has some of its roots in the Egyptian experience. So the ways in which these colonial adventures open up culture and imagination and so forth, and make Europe less closed and more cosmopolitan is also interesting. Yeah.
Tom Rice's book, The Black Count, is one that you really would enjoy along those lines.
Yeah. Yes.
These images are so powerful to us today. How many people actually saw, not the original painting, but perhaps printed copies? Were they disseminated not only in Paris, but among the Egyptians? Was that possible, or?
Sure. So all of the great paintings, or not all, but a very large number of the great paintings that came out of the French expedition to Egypt had later engraved and lithographed reproductions. And they're very common, and they show up in universal histories or histories of modern Europe and so forth. Bonaparte actually brought a printing press with him to Egypt, which was capable of producing Arabic characters, and so he would do these broadsides and propaganda literature with it. He had Maltese with him who knew Arabic and helped him with that. But he took it back with him after he left, or the French took it back. So printing doesn't start back up until the 1820s, and it's an Egyptian government enterprise initially for much of the first half of the 19th century. You don't have really print capitalism, you have state print capitalism. But it's kind of the next generations of the Egyptians all saw those engravings. And I mean, what they call Alhamdulillah al-Faransi, or the French campaign, the French called it an exposition, the Egyptians called it a campaign, is a keynote in modern Egyptian history. And Romantic Egyptian nationalists, as nationalism took hold in Egypt, often would, in a way, privilege the French invasion of Egypt as kicking off a lot of modern developments. And it is true, the French sort of fatally weakened the Mamluk caste and helped with the transformation of Egypt into a kind of agricultural capitalist society from being more quote-unquote feudal, land-oriented and time-tenure-oriented and so forth. Yes, I mean, this episode lives in Egyptian consciousness. And there was even a big, which I talk about at the end of the book, a big controversy in 1998, the 200-year anniversary, about whether to commemorate it in Egypt and in France. And it was so controversial by then that it didn't get commemorated in either place.
The Mamluk, exactly what were the Mamluk?
The Mamluks, Malika is to possess, so Mamluk is somebody who's possessed. So it literally means a kind of slave. But it was an institution in the Mediterranean and in much of the Muslim world, whereby, you know, the problem for rulers in societies with strong kinship politics is that if you promote somebody to be your chief of staff, to be the head of your army, and that man comes from a kinship group, tribe or clan, whatever you want to call it, then what's to stop him from mobilizing his clan against the king and just taking over? So basically you want a kind of what the modern political scientists call coup-proofing. How could you stop these militaries from making coups? So one way to do it would be to have the military not have kinship ties. And what group in society doesn't have kinship ties in pre-modern times are slaves. The definition of slavery is social alienation from your original kinship group. So they would buy slaves from wherever they were being sold, and military campaigns produced slaves. So when the Ottomans were fighting the Circassians in the Caucasus, they would take Circassian slaves, and then they would sell them on the international market, and the Egyptians would buy them. And so they would probably be a cavalryman. And then when they were 18 or 19, when they started to get a beard, they would be free. But they retained kind of houses, the relationships that came out of the barracks and the slave system that they had been brought up in. The theory that this would prevent coups turned out to be incorrect, because it turns out that the slaves recreate kinship-like relationships, and then they make coups anyway. So they actually came to power. There were a different kind of slavery, a different group. But in the early medieval period, there was a Mamluk rulership in Egypt, and then in the late Ottoman period, a new kind of Mamluk rule emerged. Yeah.
Might Napoleon have met with more success had he brought canteens and mills with him so he could have food and water? Because thousands of his troops died from lack of nutrition and water. Or was Nelson's decisive defeat of his fleet, or was that more significant? Well, I'm sure it was more significant, but was that more important?
Well, he brought so many troops that the ones who died of renal failure because he didn't give them canteens, being from a tropical island, he didn't think about marching through the desert. The ones who died from renal failure were relatively small. They did have high mortality. We think only half of them came back. But it wasn't just thirst that killed them. They got plague, they got eye disease. There's a kind of eye disease that was common in Egypt at that time where you get an infection and your eyelashes turn in and destroy your cornea. So they went blind, a lot of them. And
There's about the lack of portable mills, because they had all that wheat, but they couldn't eat because they had nothing to grind it.
Yeah. Well, the Egyptians had bread, and they had their own ways of making it. And it wasn't that they starved to death, really. It was, they fought a lot of battles. They never really controlled Egypt. The peasantry mounted a kind of guerrilla war against them. So they were always being shot at in the Delta, in the villages, whenever they tried to move around. And this went all 3 years. I found accounts from 1800 in the French Bibliothèque Nationale, not being able to move around the Delta very easily because of being shot at. Then Bonaparte took them on this fruitless attempt to, once Nelson sank the fleet, the only way back out, or the only way forward, would be to take Syria. And maybe having Syria, you could think about taking Turkey or go towards India. And so he threw a lot of troops against Syria, but there was an old Crusader fort that the Ottomans had picked up, and it was impenetrable. He couldn't get heavy artillery over there. You could have just blown holes in the walls with heavy artillery. But he had some light field artillery that he took with him across the desert. But when he tried to ship the heavy artillery from Alexandria, the British just captured it. So he could never break through those Crusader walls. And that fortress is in Akka, in what the Israelis now call Akko. And it would be a really interesting little history of just that fortress, because it played an important role all through Syrian and Palestinian history. And actually in the 1940s, the British imprisoned David Ben-Gurion and some of the Zionist leaders in that same fortress that Bonaparte was never able to take. Yeah.
It caught my attention in your book that he brought a Greek printing press along.
Yes.
I haven't gotten past page 50 yet, so I don't know what happened. Did he actually appeal to the Greeks? Because I remember, like when NASA came, he sent all the Greeks from Alexandria, thousands of them, back to Greece. Mm-hmm. Were they already there as a major force, or what happened there?
Well, I don't think that the printing press was used to print in Greek. I think it was just the provenance of it, because movable type printing presses were rare in the Arab world at that time. And they reconfigured it so that it could do French or Arabic letters. And the Greek population of Alexandria at that time was tiny. Through the 19th century, this is something that is a characteristic of the greater Mediterranean. You have these enormous labor flows all through modern history. So in the course of the 19th century, as I said, Egypt developed capitalist agriculture, so it started selling its commodities on the world market. One of them was cotton. And they had an indigenous strain of long stable cotton, which the British factories in Manchester and so they really liked. It worked well with the factories. And so Egyptian cotton became a big thing, and during the 1860s, during our Civil War, they couldn't get cotton from the south, and there was a cotton famine. And so Egyptian cotton became very valuable, and the volume of it made more people put it in Egypt. And so it created this kind of these primary commodity sales, created opportunities for import-export merchants. And so a lot of Greeks came to Alexandria to be middlemen. And then once you had a lot of wealthy merchants, then of course people came to serve them with restaurants and so forth. So you had a really significant Greek population in Alexandria by the 1860s and then forward until World War II. And then the Italians also came, and there were smaller but significant French and British residents. So Egypt became very cosmopolitan in the course of the 19th century.